Alexander Carter almost waited another day. Not because he'd changed his mind, because the house still sounded like home. Zariah was already in the kitchen. The coffee maker hissed softly while bacon crackled in the pan. Somewhere between the stove and the sink, she hummed a tune he recognized but couldn't have named. It had been part of their mornings for so long that he'd stopped hearing it years ago. She reached for the salt, paused, looked at the skillet. A quiet smile crossed her face. "I already seasoned it." She gave a small shake of her head, set the shaker back where it belonged, and moved on. Alexander watched for another second before setting his briefcase on the floor. She almost never forgot little things. Without thinking, she reached for 2 coffee mugs. She filled one. Her hand stopped over the second. For a long moment, she simply stood there. Then she rinsed the empty mug, dried it with the dish towel, and slid it back into the cabinet. Neither of them said a word. "You left your blue jacket downstairs," she said. Alexander glanced toward the staircase. "I haven't worn that one in months." "I know." She walked over anyway, picked it up, smoothed the collar with her fingertips, brushed away a tiny speck of lint, then hung it neatly beside the front door. Outside, the sprinkler clicked across the lawn. Inside, the bacon continued to hiss. The only sound between them was the quiet rhythm of another ordinary morning. "Do you want breakfast now?" she asked. "Or should I keep it warm?" Alexander looked at her. His lips parted. Nothing came. She waited, just long enough for an answer that didn't arrive. Then she nodded once. "I'll keep it warm." She opened the drawer and took out 2 forks. She laid both beside the plates. Her hand rested on one of them. After a moment, she picked it back up and returned it to the drawer. The soft click echoed through the kitchen. Alexander looked at the empty place beside the plate, then at Zariah. He almost said something. Instead, he looked away. He drew one slow breath. "Zariah." She turned. She didn't ask what he wanted. She didn't ask if something was wrong. She simply waited. Years later, Alexander couldn't remember the first sentence he spoke that morning. What he remembered was the quiet click of that second fork sliding back into the drawer. At the time, it had sounded like nothing. Welcome to Greer's Stories, where life's biggest turning points rarely arrive with raised voices. They begin in ordinary kitchens, familiar routines, and quiet moments that seem forgettable, until one day you realize they changed everything. The moving truck had barely stopped across the street before a little boy wandered away from his parents. He walked straight toward the wooden swing beneath the maple tree. It creaked once in the morning breeze. He looked up at it, as though deciding whether swings were meant to be admired or used. "Evan!" His mother hurried across the street, slightly out of breath. "I'm so sorry. He has absolutely no sense of personal space." Before she reached him, the front door of the Carter house opened. Zariah stepped onto the porch, carrying a watering can. "It's okay." She smiled at the boy. "What do you think?" He pointed at the swing. "It squeaks." "It does." "Why?" "I've never fixed it." He looked genuinely puzzled. "Isn't it broken?" Zariah shook her head. "No, but it makes noise. So do old floors." He considered that. "My grandma says houses are supposed to. I think your grandma and I would have gotten along." The boy smiled. Behind her, the front door opened again. Alexander stepped outside, balancing a travel mug, a leather portfolio, and his car keys with the confidence of someone attempting 1 trip instead of 2. Halfway down the steps, he stopped. Pockets. Without looking up from the lavender she was trimming, Zariah held out his sunglasses. "You'll need these." He took them automatically. 2 more steps. He stopped again. "My phone." She pointed toward the roof of the car. "You left it there." He looked. There it was. The boy watched the exchange carefully. "How'd she know?" Alexander looked at him. "Practice." Zariah smiled without looking up. 12 years. Alexander finally reached the swing. He nudged it gently with one finger. It answered with the same familiar squeak. "I still think we should oil the chain." "You've been saying that for 8 years." "It would sound better." She looked over. No. The boy frowned. Why? Zoraya walked over and rested one hand against the seat. Every summer my nieces race through that gate. She pointed toward the driveway. I hear the swing before I see them. Alexander laughed. I lose this argument every spring. So who won? The boy asked. Alexander slipped his sunglasses on. I married her. The boy thought for a second. I think you both did. Alexander looked toward Zoraya. I've been trying to explain that. She smiled. Maybe he'll have better luck. The boy's mother finally caught up. I'm sorry again. No need. Zoraya handed the watering can to Alexander. Would you mind? He took it without a word. She turned back toward the little boy. Welcome to the neighborhood. As they crossed the street, the boy looked over his shoulder one last time. I like your house. Neither Alexander nor Zoraya answered immediately. They looked at each other first. Then Alexander said, We do too. The lobby at Carter & Vale Luxury Architecture smelled faintly of cedar and fresh coffee. An intern hurried past, carrying fabric samples stacked high enough to block her view. She nearly collided with a delivery driver. I'm so sorry. My fault, the driver laughed. You architects hide corners. Across the room, someone in the break area groaned. I burned the bagels. A chorus of good-natured complaints answered from the design studio. It isn't Tuesday without burnt bagels. Laughter drifted across the office. Nothing about Carter & Vale felt rushed. Busy, yes. Rushed, never. Near the large-format printer, Emma, one of the newest design assistants, stood staring at a stack of presentation boards. She counted them once, then again. Alexander noticed the movement before he noticed her expression. Emma? She turned too quickly. I think I ruined the Morgan presentation. He looked at the printer. She looked ready to apologize again. Instead, he set down his coffee. Show me. She pointed toward the printer tray. It jammed. Alexander crouched beside the machine. Within seconds, he pulled out a wrinkled rendering, adjusted one roller, and closed the side panel. The printer hummed. A fresh rendering slid into place. Emma exhaled. I'm really sorry. Alexander handed her the print. You'll make bigger mistakes. She blinked. I will? I still do. She laughed. I don't believe you. You will. He smiled. The important part is making a different one next time. Emma nodded, visibly calmer. Across the room, Zoraya had already gathered the presentation boards. Without saying anything, she rearranged them. Emma frowned. The floor plans are supposed to go first. Zoraya lifted one handwritten page. What does this say? Emma read aloud. What do you want your home to feel like on an ordinary Tuesday? She looked confused. It isn't about the house. No, it's about the people. Emma read a few more lines. Pancakes before school, Grandpa's chair near the morning sun, neighbors who never knocked because they already felt welcome. She looked back up. So, this comes before the blueprints? It always does. Nathan and Elise Morgan arrived exactly on time. Nathan carried a notebook full of measurements. Elise carried a faded photograph. Alexander noticed both. He greeted them warmly and spread the plans across the conference table. For the next several minutes, the conversation belonged to roof lines, drainage, energy efficiency, and construction schedules. Nathan leaned forward with every answer. Elise stayed quiet, not withdrawn, listening. Alexander answered another question about window placement. Then he stopped. He looked toward Elise. You've disagreed with me 3 times. She looked surprised. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. Nathan smiled. She's usually thinking before the rest of us. Alexander nodded. I figured. Elise unfolded the photograph. An older woman stood in a small kitchen, smiling toward someone behind the camera. My grandmother. Alexander looked at the picture. You brought her. I always do. She rested the photograph beside the plans. I keep trying to imagine where she'd sit. Alexander studied the drawing. Everything worked. The proportions, the structure, the sight lines. Beside him, Zariah leaned forward. What time did she usually bake? Saturday mornings. Before anyone else? Elise smiled. The whole house smelled like cinnamon. Zariah turned the drawing slightly. The morning light reaches this corner first. Alexander followed her finger. He erased one wall, shifted 2 cabinets, moved the breakfast nook toward the eastern windows. He sat back. Nathan studied the revision. We didn't lose anything. Alexander smiled. No, we found something. Elise looked at the drawing for several seconds. Then she laughed through a shaky breath. There she is. The room fell quiet. No one asked another question. They didn't need to. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Nathan shook Alexander's hand. I've hired architects before. He looked around the room. This is the first time it felt like someone wanted to know us before drawing the house. Alexander thanked him. As Nathan stepped outside, Elise lingered. She looked at Zariah, crossed the room, and hugged her. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It lasted only a moment. When she stepped back, she smiled. Thank you. Then she left. The front door closed softly behind them. Emma walked into the conference room carrying the empty coffee cups. She paused when she saw the handwritten questionnaire still lying beside the blueprints. For a second, she looked from the page to the plans, then back again. Without anyone telling her, she placed the questionnaire on top of the next client's folder before carrying the cups away. Alexander watched her from the doorway. He didn't say anything. Neither did Zariah. They simply walked into the next meeting together. By the following Tuesday, the office had already settled into its familiar rhythm. Phones rang. Someone laughed near the sample library. The smell of burnt bagels drifted from the break room. It's Karen again, one designer called. I heard that, Karen answered, laughing. No one seemed bothered. It felt like the kind of place where people had learned each other's routines well enough to enjoy them. Alexander stepped out of his office, fastening the cuff of his shirt. Has anyone seen my passport? 3 people looked up. Before anyone could answer, Zariah glanced toward the blue leather portfolio resting beside the conference table. Inside the side pocket, Alexander unzipped it. There you are. He held it up with an exaggerated sigh of relief. I would have made it all the way to the airport. You would have realized halfway there. I was hoping you'd say that wasn't true. She tilted her head. It wouldn't be. A few people nearby laughed. Alexander walked over, lightly touched her shoulder as he passed, and headed toward the elevator. Neither of them treated the exchange as unusual. Apparently it happened often enough that no one in the office even looked up anymore. Emma arrived carrying tomorrow's schedule. I think I made a mistake. Zariah motioned toward the chair across from her desk. What happened? I double-booked Mr. Henderson. They looked over the calendar together. Zariah traced one line with her finger. No, Emma frowned. They're both at 2. They're the same client. Emma stared for another second, then laughed at herself. I should probably stop panicking before I read the page. It saves time. Emma smiled. I honestly don't know how you remember all this. Zariah reached for the small notebook beside her keyboard. The cover had softened with use. Inside were names, children, favorite coffee orders, food allergies, wedding anniversaries, flight numbers, graduation dates, tiny details collected over years. Emma turned another page. You wrote all of this? I forget things. Emma looked surprised. You do? Every day. She closed the notebook. So I stopped trusting my memory. Near lunch, the office phone rang. Mrs. Carter? It was Mr. Ramirez. My daughter's surgery went well. I'm glad. I wanted to thank you. You already did. No. He laughed softly. You made it possible for me to stay with her. After they hung up, Zariah crossed tomorrow's site visit off the calendar, shifted 2 meetings, and made 3 quick phone calls. When she finished, the revised schedule looked as though it had always belonged that way. Alexander stepped out of a client meeting carrying a stack of material samples. Ready for San Francisco? I think so. She looked at him. I put your charger in the briefcase. I would have forgotten it. I know. My presentation boards. In the trunk. He laughed. I wasn't going to forget those. She raised an eyebrow. No? Probably. As he reached the lobby, a client stopped him. Mr. Carter, before you go, the woman extended her hand. You've assembled an incredible team. Alexander nodded. I'm fortunate. She smiled politely. You, especially. Alexander glanced toward the design studio where Zariah was helping Emma organize folders. Actually. The client followed his eyes. The office feels the way our future house will feel. He smiled. That's something my wife taught all of us. Across the room, Zariah never looked up. She was explaining tomorrow's schedule to Emma. The client turned back toward Alexander. I'll make sure I thank her before we leave. By early evening, the office slowly emptied. Computer screens went dark, one by one. Someone wished everyone a good night. A vacuum hummed somewhere down the hallway. Emma gathered the coffee mugs left behind after the final meeting. As she passed Alexander's office, she noticed Zariah inside. She wasn't working. She was straightening the photograph on his desk. The frame had shifted slightly. She adjusted it until it sat square. She picked up the half-finished coffee beside it, turned on the faucet, rinsed the cup, paused for a brief moment, then dried it and returned it to the exact place Alexander always reached first thing each morning. Emma stood in the hallway. For a second, she considered walking in. Instead, she quietly continued toward the kitchen. Before locking her desk, Zariah opened one of the drawers. Inside lay a folded note. She unfolded it long enough to read the first line. Don't skip breakfast tomorrow. You always think more clearly after you've eaten. She smiled to herself, folded it again, and slipped it into the inside pocket of Alexander's laptop bag. Then she zipped the compartment closed. Several hours later, Alexander settled into his seat on the plane. He reached into the bag for a project folder. His phone vibrated. A contractor had a question. Then another message arrived. By the time boarding finished, the laptop bag rested beneath the seat in front of him, still closed. The next morning, Emma unlocked the office before anyone else arrived. She stacked the first client's folder on the conference table. As she did, a single handwritten page slid onto the floor. She picked it up. Across the top were the familiar words. What do you want your home to feel like on an ordinary Tuesday? At that moment, the front door opened. A young couple stepped inside with their 8-year-old daughter. While her parents signed in, the little girl wandered toward the conference table. She looked at the page, then read it aloud. What do you want your home to feel like on an ordinary Tuesday? She looked up at her mother. What does that mean? Her mother smiled. I don't know. She reached for her husband's hand. I guess that's why we're here. Emma carefully placed the page back on top of the folder. Then she opened the conference room door. Mr. and Mrs. Lawson? Alexander and Zariah were already walking down the hallway together. Without saying a word, Alexander held the door open. Zariah stepped inside first. The questionnaire remained on top of the folder between them. Dinner was already on the table when Alexander walked in. I thought your meeting ended at 6. It did. He loosened his tie. Traffic. Zariah nodded and uncovered the serving dish. I kept it warm. He smiled. I appreciate it. They sat across from each other. For a while, the only sounds were forks against plates and the faint hum of the dishwasher. Alexander finally looked up. The Henderson project was approved. That's wonderful. They want construction to start early. She nodded. I'm glad. A few seconds passed. Alexander reached for another piece of bread. Years earlier, that conversation might have stretched another 20 minutes. Tonight, it settled gently between them before either realized there was nothing else to add. The next morning, Alexander stood near the front door searching the hallway table. My keys? They're in yesterday's jacket. He checked. They are. He slipped them into his pocket. You save me every morning. You save yourself. Not nearly as often. She smiled faintly and returned to packing his lunch. As he reached the door, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. A message from the nonprofit Housing Foundation asking whether he could attend an introductory meeting that Friday. He read it once, Then again, "You heading out?" Zariah asked. He looked up. "Yeah." He slid the phone into his pocket. "I'll tell you about something later." "Okay." The front door closed. The sentence stayed behind. Friday afternoon found Alexander in a modest community center on the east side of the city. The folding chairs didn't match. Coffee was served in paper cups. Children's artwork covered one wall. It felt nothing like the polished presentation rooms where he usually met clients. People weren't talking about imported stone or panoramic views. They were talking about leaking roofs, rent increases, safe sidewalks. A volunteer pinned another neighborhood map to a corkboard. "We don't need bigger houses," an older man said. "We need homes our grandchildren can afford to come back to." Alexander wrote something in the margin of his notebook, then crossed it out. He listened instead. When the meeting ended, volunteers gathered stacks of folders and carried chairs back against the walls. A woman with rolled-up sleeves moved from table to table, making sure every resident left with the correct packet. Someone thanked her as they walked past. She waved without stopping. A board member noticed Alexander watching. "Have you met Ariel?" He shook his head. "Not yet. She keeps this place running." Ariel walked over carrying 2 binders. "You must be Alexander Carter." "I am." She offered him one of the folders. "I've admired some of your firm's work." "Thank you." She glanced toward the residents still lingering in conversation. "I should probably warn you." "Oh?" "They'll never ask what kind of countertops you're recommending." Alexander laughed. "What will they ask?" She shrugged. "They'll ask whether their kids can ride bicycles without worrying about traffic." He looked across the room. A little girl sat on the floor, drawing houses with green crayons. One roof was crooked. Every window was open. Alexander closed the folder. "I think I have a lot to learn." "So do we." Someone called Ariel's name. She excused herself and walked away before the conversation could become anything more. Alexander watched her join a group of residents already waiting with questions. Then he looked back at the sketch the little girl had left on the table. The roof leaned slightly. The front yard held a swing beneath a tree. Without thinking, he wrote one sentence in the margin of his notebook. "Build for the life inside the walls." He closed the notebook. That evening he arrived home later than usual. Zariah sat in the living room with a blanket over her knees, reading through employee evaluations. She looked up. "How was the meeting?" Alexander set his notebook on the coffee table. "It was different." "In a good way?" "I think so." His phone vibrated. A board member. He glanced at the screen. "I should take this. It'll only be a minute." "Of course." He stepped onto the back patio. The conversation lasted longer than he expected. When he came back inside, Zariah had finished the evaluations. The notebook still rested unopened on the coffee table. She looked up from closing the folder. "Everything okay?" "Yeah." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Sorry. It's all right." She stood, carried the folders toward her office, and switched off the hallway light as she passed. Alexander remained in the living room for another moment. He looked at the notebook, then toward the hallway where Zariah had disappeared. He picked up the notebook, paused, set it back down. Upstairs, a door closed softly. Neither of them thought much about the conversation that never happened. But somewhere between the unanswered story and the quiet house, something small had been left unsaid. Neither of them noticed it. The audience already has. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They repeated. Monday, Alexander left the office 15 minutes early for the community center. On Tuesday, he skipped lunch because the nonprofit meeting ran longer than expected. By Thursday, the security guard at the community center greeted him by name before he reached the front door. No one announced these moments. They simply became part of the week. One afternoon, Alexander finished helping review a revised neighborhood plan. Residents slowly filtered toward the parking lot. A few volunteers folded tables. Others stacked chairs against the wall. Without thinking, Alexander picked up the far end of a folding table while an older man grabbed the other. "You don't have to do this," the man said. Alexander smiled. "I've been told I don't always know when to stop working." The man laughed. "My wife says the same thing." They carried the table across the room. When they set it down, the man glanced at Alexander's wedding ring. "How long have you been married?" 12 years. The man nodded thoughtfully. "That's something." Alexander smiled. "It is." The older man rested both hands on the folded table. "This place has a funny way of convincing good people they're needed everywhere." Alexander listened politely. The man continued, "Just don't let it convince you you're needed here more than you're needed at home." Alexander chuckled. "I don't think that's going to happen." "I hope not." Someone called the older man's name from across the room. He waved and walked away. Alexander picked up another chair. The conversation disappeared beneath the ordinary sounds of people cleaning up. Across town, Zariah stood in the Carter and Vale reception area. Emma hurried toward her, carrying a package. "I almost forgot these." Travel brochures, community housing proposals. Alexander's name was printed across the shipping label. "He'll want those tonight," Emma said. Zariah glanced at the clock. "He may be late." "I'll leave them on his desk." Zariah nodded. "Good idea." She didn't ask why there seemed to be more nonprofit folders every week. She simply made room for them beside the others. That evening, the porch light switched on automatically at 7. Dinner stayed warm in the oven. At 7:18, Alexander texted, "Running behind. Don't wait for me." Zariah read the message, then covered the casserole again. She opened her laptop and answered emails while the kitchen grew quiet. At 7:46, the front door opened. "I'm sorry." She looked up. "Everything okay?" Community meeting ran long. She stood and walked toward the oven. "I'll warm dinner again." Alexander loosened his tie. "You don't have to." "I already did." She smiled lightly, almost teasing. "This is only the second time." He laughed. "I owe you." "You owe me dinner when your schedule calms down." "It will." Neither of them questioned the promise. Later that night, Alexander carried his notebook into the study. He meant to review foundation estimates. Instead, he found himself staring at the rough sketch he'd made that afternoon. A courtyard, a bench beneath a tree, children's bicycles leaning against a fence. No measurements, no labels, only the spaces between people. He closed the notebook without adding another line. The next morning, he left 10 minutes earlier than usual. He paused by the kitchen. "I'm heading out." Zariah poured coffee into his travel mug. "So early?" "Community site visit." She handed him the mug. "Drive safely." "I will." He kissed her forehead. She watched him back out of the driveway. The coffee she'd poured was still too hot to drink. By the time he reached the first traffic light, his phone chimed with a reminder about the nonprofit schedule. He glanced at it only long enough to silence the notification. Then he drove on. Back at the house, Zariah noticed his lunch still sitting on the kitchen counter. She picked it up, looked toward the empty driveway, then placed it in the refrigerator. She didn't call him. She assumed he'd already eaten. She returned to her own morning, unaware that a new routine had quietly begun, one so ordinary that neither of them thought to question it, yet one that would matter far more than either realized in the months ahead. Emma paused outside Zariah's office with a presentation folder balanced against her hip. She knocked once. "Come in." "I stayed late yesterday to finish the Lawson presentation." Zariah looked up from her desk. "I noticed." Emma smiled. "I thought you'd be happy." "I am." Emma handed over the folder. "I wanted you to check it." Zariah opened it. Every page had already been marked with small adhesive notes, corrected measurements, updated contact information, one missing signature. Emma stared. "You already reviewed it?" "This morning." "What time did you get here?" Zariah shrugged lightly. "Earlier than usual." Emma looked around the office. The day's client folders were stacked in order. Coffee cups waited beside each meeting room. Fresh flowers had already been placed at reception. "You've been coming in early a lot." Zariah closed the folder. "It's quieter." Emma nodded. She wasn't sure that was the whole answer. Near noon, Alexander called. "I have bad news." "What happened?" The community meeting ran long again. "I figured." "You did?" You usually call before lunch if you're going to miss dinner." He laughed softly. "I've become predictable. Only in certain ways." A brief silence settled between them. "I'm sorry." "It's all right. I'll make it up to you. You don't owe me anything." Another pause. "I'll still try. Okay?" The call ended. Zoraya looked at the phone for a second before slipping it into her pocket. She opened the oven and lowered the temperature without saying a word. The house was quiet when Alexander finally came home. The kitchen lights were still on. A covered plate rested inside the warming drawer. He smiled. "Zoraya?" No answer. He carried the plate to the dining table. Beside it lay a folded note. "Vegetables are still in the oven. Don't leave them too long. They'll dry out. Sleep well if I'm already asleep." He read it twice, then unfolded his napkin beside the plate. Dinner was exactly the way she always served it. After eating, he rinsed the dishes. He dried the plate carefully before putting it away. The folded note remained in his hand. Instead of throwing it away, he slipped it into his wallet behind an old receipt. Upstairs, the bedroom door stayed closed. He stood outside it for a moment, then quietly turned the handle. Zoraya was asleep with a book resting open across the blanket. Alexander lifted the book gently, placed a bookmark between the pages, and set it on the bedside table. He pulled the blanket a little higher over her shoulder. She never woke. The following afternoon, Alexander left a construction meeting earlier than planned. On the drive home, he noticed the bakery Zoraya liked. He checked the time. Still open. He parked. 5 minutes later, he walked out, carrying a small paper bag. The woman behind the counter smiled. "The lemon loaf again? My wife says yours is better than hers." The baker laughed. "She's kind." "No." Alexander smiled. "She's honest." When he arrived home, the house was empty. Zoraya had already gone back to the office for an evening client meeting. Alexander placed the bakery bag on the kitchen counter. He wrote only 3 words on the receipt: "For tomorrow morning." Then he headed upstairs to change. Saturday arrived without alarms. For once, neither of them had an early meeting. Alexander carried 2 mugs of coffee onto the patio. Zoraya was kneeling beside the herb garden, brushing loose soil away from a basil plant. "You started without me." The basil wasn't waiting. He handed her one of the mugs. They worked side by side. No deadlines. No ringing phones. Only birds somewhere above the maple tree. After several quiet minutes, Alexander leaned back. "We should disappear for a weekend." She looked over. "I'd love that. When things settle down." She nodded. "They will." Neither reached for a calendar. Neither noticed they had made the same promise 3 times that year. A breeze moved through the garden. The conversation drifted away with it. Monday morning arrived before sunrise. Emma unlocked the office and found Zoraya already arranging folders inside the conference room. "I thought I was early." "You are." Emma hesitated. "You don't have to keep doing all this yourself." Zoraya adjusted one chair that sat slightly out of line. "It's faster." Emma waited. Zoraya rested one hand on the back of the chair. Sometimes, asking someone else feels like giving them one more thing to carry. Emma looked around the room. "And carrying it yourself?" Zoraya smiled, though only for a moment. "I'm used to it." Neither woman said anything after that. The coffee machine clicked on in the break room. The office slowly came to life. That evening, Zoraya stopped by the grocery store on her way home. She reached automatically for Alexander's favorite dark chocolate, then fresh rosemary, then the soup he always wanted after difficult presentations. By the time she reached the checkout, rain had started outside. As she pulled into the driveway, headlights swept across the front lawn. She looked up. The lights continued past the house. She sat for another second, with the engine running, then switched it off. Inside, she unpacked the groceries 1 bag at a time. She tucked the chocolate behind the cereal boxes where it wouldn't melt. The soup went into the pantry, the rosemary into a glass of water beside the sink. A few minutes later, the front door opened. Alexander stepped inside carrying his briefcase, slightly damp from the rain. "I'm sorry." She looked up from the cutting board. "You made it." "I almost didn't stop." He lifted a small paper bag from the bakery. I remembered something. She opened it. Lemon loaf. She looked at him. I thought you had meetings all day. I did. She smiled, not broadly, just enough for him to notice. I'll make coffee. He hung his coat by the door. Neither of them mentioned the rain. Neither of them mentioned the late hour. In the kitchen, she sliced the loaf into 2 uneven pieces and set the larger one on his plate without thinking. He noticed. He didn't switch them. He simply reached across the counter and rested his hand over hers for a brief moment before letting go. The kettle began to whistle. Both of them turned toward the stove. The conversation moved on before either realized that, for one ordinary evening, they had found each other again. The first meeting that ran late felt unusual. The 5th one felt normal. Alexander stopped promising exact times because he almost never kept them anymore. Instead, he sent short messages, running behind. Don't wait for dinner. I'll explain when I get home. The explanations almost never happened, not because he chose not to tell her, because by the time he walked through the front door, both of them were tired enough that tomorrow always seemed like the better time. Tomorrow became a habit. One evening, Alexander arrived home carrying a rolled-up site plan. Zariah looked up from the dining table. How did the neighborhood presentation go? He set the drawings beside the chair. They approved the courtyard. The one with the shared garden? He looked surprised. You remembered. You mentioned it last week. He smiled. I think you'd like it. I'd love to hear about it. His phone vibrated across the table. A board member. Alexander looked at the screen. I should answer this. Go ahead. He stepped onto the back patio. The call lasted 12 minutes. When he came back inside, Zariah had already cleared the dinner plates. She looked up from the sink. Everything okay? Yeah. He glanced toward the rolled-up plans. For a second, it looked as though he might open them. Instead, he picked them up. I'll show you tomorrow. She nodded. I'll be here. Neither of them knew that tomorrow's conversation would never happen. At the community center, the project continued to grow. Alexander spent more time listening than talking. Residents argued over playground locations. Parents wanted wider sidewalks. Grandparents wanted benches beneath shade trees. One afternoon, after everyone else had left, Alexander stayed behind stacking folding chairs with Ariel. Neither of them spoke much. The room echoed with the scrape of metal legs against the floor. An elderly volunteer walked back in for the jacket he'd forgotten. He smiled when he saw them working. I knew I'd find somebody still cleaning up. Alexander laughed. We're almost done. The man looked at Alexander's wedding ring. Your wife doesn't mind how much time this place takes? Alexander answered without hesitation. She's always supported my work. I'm glad. The volunteer picked up his jacket. My Eleanor used to support everything I did too. He paused at the doorway. I spent years thinking support meant she needed less from me than she really did. The room stayed quiet. The man smiled gently. Drive home safe. He left. Alexander picked up another chair. Ariel folded the last table. Neither mentioned what the volunteer had said. The following Saturday, Alexander unexpectedly had the morning free. He found Zariah in the garage sorting boxes marked community donations. I can help. She handed him a roll of packing tape. They worked side by side. Children's books, winter coats, kitchen supplies. Every few minutes she set another box near the door. You've been collecting all this yourself? Mostly the neighbors. You organized it? She nodded. It wasn't much. Alexander looked around the garage. It was more than he'd realized. I didn't know. You've had a lot going on. She smiled and sealed another box. So have you. He wanted to tell her about the community center, about the families, about the courtyard, about the little girl who insisted every house needed a porch swing. Instead, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. The board chair. Zariah noticed. You should take it. You don't mind? I know it's important. He answered the call as he walked toward the driveway. When it ended nearly 20 minutes later, the garage was empty. The donation boxes were gone. Only one roll of tape remained on the workbench. Alexander stood there for a moment, then quietly put the tape back in the drawer. Over the following weeks, the unfinished conversations became ordinary. "I'll tell you later. We'll talk this weekend. After this deadline, when things slow down." Neither of them doubted those promises when they made them. Neither noticed how many of them remained unfinished. One evening, after another long planning session, Alexander and Ariel walked toward the parking lot. The sun had already disappeared behind the buildings. Ariel unlocked her car but didn't get in. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Alexander waited. "When you talk about your marriage." She chose her words carefully. "You always speak in the past tense." He looked down at the pavement. "It feels like we've been saying goodbye for a long time." She studied him. "Have you ever actually asked Zariah whether she feels the same?" He didn't answer. After a moment she nodded. "I think that's your answer." She closed the car door without getting inside. "I'm not judging you. I know. I just don't ever want to become someone's reason for avoiding a conversation they still owe another person." Alexander nodded slowly. "I understand." Neither of them moved. Finally, Ariel spoke again. "Go home." He gave a small nod. "I will." The drive back to Bel Air felt strangely quiet. Alexander turned into the familiar driveway. The porch light glowed against the evening sky. Through the kitchen window, he could see Zariah setting 2 plates on the table. She moved with the same calm rhythm she always had. Coffee already measured for the morning. His favorite dinner warming in the drawer. The small vase of fresh herbs she replaced every Sunday. He stayed in the driver's seat after the engine stopped. His wedding ring caught the dashboard light. He turned it once with his thumb, then opened the car door. Inside, the house smelled exactly the way it always did. Zariah looked up and smiled. "There you are. I got held up. I figured." She placed another serving spoon beside his plate. "Dinner's ready." Alexander stood in the middle of the kitchen. He looked at the coffee maker, the hallway they had painted together, the family photograph above the sideboard. His ring still rested on his finger. For one brief moment, it seemed as though he might sit down. Instead, the sentence he had postponed through 100 unfinished conversations finally found its way into the room. "You're not my wife anymore." Silence answered first. Zariah searched his face. Not in confusion, not in anger, as though she were trying to understand whether he had finally said aloud something he had been carrying for months. Then she quietly turned toward the hallway. No raised voices, no accusations, only the soft sound of a suitcase being lifted down from the closet shelf. The gate didn't open. Alexander slowed the SUV until it stopped in front of the security scanner. He waited. Nothing. He leaned toward the window and pressed the access button again. A calm voice answered through the speaker. "Good morning. May I help you?" "It's Alexander Carter." A brief pause. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. Your access isn't active." Alexander frowned. "There has to be a mistake. Would you mind trying your fingerprint?" He stepped out. The scanner glowed beneath his thumb. A soft tone sounded. "Access denied." He tried again. Then facial recognition. Another tone. "Access denied." He looked toward the house. Everything appeared exactly as it always had. The gardener was trimming the lavender beside the front walk. A delivery van stopped at the neighboring property. The porch light switched itself off as the morning sun reached the front steps. Nothing looked different. Only him. Behind him, Ariel lowered her window. "Everything okay? I think the system needs to be reset." He sounded puzzled, not angry. He walked back to the speaker. "Could you call inside?" "Of course." The wait lasted less than a minute. It felt much longer. Alexander watched the maple tree sway gently near the front walk. The wooden swing beneath it moved with the breeze. Its chain answered with the same familiar squeak he had heard hundreds of times without really listening. The speaker clicked again. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes." "I spoke with Mrs. Carter." Alexander straightened, almost instinctively. "What did she say?" Another pause. "She asked me to ask whether you left your blue notebook in the study." He didn't answer. "She said one of the pages is folded over, and she didn't want it damaged." Alexander stared through the gate, the notebook. Out of everything she could have said, she remembered the notebook. The guard waited politely. She said she'll keep it somewhere safe until you let her know what you'd like done with it. Alexander swallowed. Thank you. The speaker fell silent. His phone rang. His attorney. Alexander answered immediately. I need you to tell me this is a mistake. I was hoping I'd reach you first. They won't let me through the gate. A quiet breath came from the other end. I've finished reviewing the property documents. Alexander looked toward the house again. And the Bel Air estate has always remained in the Zariah Family Living Trust. Silence. So, Alexander finally said, I never owned it? Another pause. Legally. No. Nothing else. The line stayed quiet. Alexander lowered the phone before the attorney could continue. He stood without moving. Beyond the gate, the gardener rolled up the hose and walked toward the side yard. The watering can still rested beside the porch steps. A pair of gardening gloves lay folded exactly where Zariah usually left them. The herb garden near the kitchen windows looked freshly tended. Everything felt familiar. Strangely, more familiar than it had in years. The swing creaked again. Alexander looked toward it. For years, he had teased Zariah about oiling the chain. Every spring, every single spring. A memory returned with unexpected clarity. A little boy standing beneath the tree. It squeaks. I know. Isn't it broken? No. Why not? Because I hear it before I see my nieces. At the time, he had laughed. Standing outside the gate, he didn't laugh. He simply listened. The breeze moved through the branches. The swing answered again. He took one step toward the entrance. His hand lifted slightly, then stopped. He didn't reach for the chain. He left it exactly as it was. A maintenance truck pulled in behind him. The driver climbed out and smiled politely. Morning, Mr. Carter. Alexander nodded. The driver spoke into the security intercom. The gate opened immediately. The truck rolled slowly up the driveway. Before it closed again, Alexander caught one last glimpse of the front porch, the watering can, the lavender, the reading chair beside the window, the front door. Then the gate closed with the same quiet mechanical sound it had always made. The only difference was where Alexander was standing. He returned to the SUV and settled behind the steering wheel. Neither he nor Ariel spoke. He reached automatically into his jacket pocket. Without looking, his fingers closed around the old brass house key. He pulled it out, turned it over once in his hand. The edges had been worn smooth after years of carrying it. He looked at the gate, then at the key. For 12 years, he had carried it every day. For 12 years, he had almost never needed it. The gate had always opened long before he reached the front door. He rested the key in his palm for another moment, then quietly slipped it back into his pocket. Outside, the swing creaked once more. Alexander started the engine. In the passenger seat, Ariel continued looking through the windshield. After several minutes, she spoke without turning her head. She remembered your notebook. Alexander didn't answer. The car rolled away from the gate. In the rearview mirror, the house disappeared behind the trees. The sound of the swing lingered long after it was out of sight. Monday morning looked exactly like every Monday before it. The lights came on. Coffee brewed in the break room. Designers carried sample boards through the hallway. Phones began ringing before 8. From the outside, Carter and Vale hadn't changed at all. Inside, Alexander noticed the reception desk before he noticed anything else. It wasn't empty. Emma was already there. She looked up and smiled. Good morning. Morning. She glanced toward the hallway behind him. For half a second, she seemed to expect someone else to walk through the door. Then she remembered. Coffee's ready, she said quietly. Alexander nodded. So is Mrs. Carter's calendar. Emma smiled apologetically. I still almost said it. Neither of them corrected the habit. The first client presentation started on schedule. Alexander walked the couple through the floor plans, window placement, natural light, stone selections, outdoor living space. Everything fit together perfectly. When he finished, the husband leaned back with a satisfied smile. It's beautiful. His wife nodded. It really is. She looked down at the drawings. Our friends recommended your company. Alexander smiled. I'm glad. They kept saying something. What was that? She laughed softly. They said your firm designs houses that somehow understand the people living inside them. Alexander waited. She rested one hand on the presentation board. This one is elegant. Another pause. I'm just not sure it knows us yet. No one spoke. Alexander thanked them for their honesty. The meeting ended a few minutes later. Back in the design studio, Alexander picked up one of the new client folders. Something felt incomplete. He flipped through every page. Budgets, material schedules, construction timelines. No handwritten questionnaire. He looked toward Emma. There used to be another page. Emma frowned. What page? The one clients filled out before the first meeting. She hesitated. I've never seen one. Alexander stared at the folder. Before he could answer, Lily stepped into the office carrying pastries from the bakery across the street. She had retired 6 months earlier, but still stopped by every few weeks. Morning, everyone. The room brightened immediately. After hugs and greetings, Lily noticed the folder in Alexander's hand. Oh, you found one of the new packets. Alexander nodded. They're missing something. Lily looked puzzled. You mean Mrs. Carter's questionnaire? Alexander looked up. You knew about it? Lily blinked. I thought you wrote it. Silence. The office suddenly felt much quieter. Lily looked between Alexander and Emma. I'm sorry. I assumed everyone knew. Alexander didn't answer. Emma looked from one to the other. You've both been talking about this questionnaire like it was famous. Lily smiled. It kind of was. That afternoon, Alexander unlocked the archive room. He searched old project boxes until he found one from 8 years earlier. Inside lay sketches, material samples, construction schedules. Near the bottom rested a single cream-colored page. Across the top, in Zariah's handwriting, what do you want your home to feel like on an ordinary Tuesday? He read every answer. Not one mentioned square footage. Not one mentioned resale value. Not one asked for expensive finishes. Instead, a place where Dad can fall asleep after lunch without hearing traffic. A kitchen where everybody naturally gathers. A window seat where my daughter can watch thunderstorms. Alexander closed the folder very carefully. Later that week, Emma appeared in his doorway carrying a thick 3-ring binder. I found something while cleaning. The cover simply read, Office Rhythms. Alexander opened it. No blueprints, no budgets, only people. Employee birthdays, client anniversaries, hospital visits, volunteer schedules, children's names, favorite coffee orders. Contractors who preferred phone calls instead of emails. Small notes written in the margins. Offer coffee before discussing numbers. People make better decisions after they feel seen. Another page. Ask about ordinary Tuesdays before holidays. Families live more Tuesdays than celebrations. Another. Never make returning clients introduce themselves twice if you can help it. Alexander kept turning pages. Then one loose sheet slipped into his lap. Not instructions. Just a note. In Zariah's handwriting. If I ever get hit by a bus, please tell whoever replaces me that people remember how you made them feel long after they forget what the walls looked like. He smiled automatically. The smile faded almost as quickly. The following morning, Alexander decided to use the questionnaire himself. A young couple sat across from him. He slid the page across the table. I'd like to start with something we used to ask every family. They smiled. He read aloud. What do you want your home to feel like on an ordinary Tuesday? The husband answered first. I want our kids to run straight to the kitchen after school. His wife nodded. I want my grandmother to feel comfortable staying with us. Alexander wrote every word. He looked back at the page, then at them. For the first time in years, he didn't know what the next question should be. He realized the questionnaire had never been the gift. The gift had been the woman who knew what to do after the answer. That Friday, another client meeting ended. The couple stood to leave. At the door, the wife smiled warmly. I think we're getting there. Alexander nodded. So do I. She looked around the conference room. My sister always said your company made her feel known before it made her feel impressed. She laughed softly. I finally understand what she meant. After they left, Alexander remained alone. The binder rested on the conference table. He reached out and ran his thumb slowly across the handwritten cover. Office rhythms. Outside his office, phones rang. Designers debated finishes. Contracts were signed. The company was still successful. For the first time, Alexander understood that everyone around him had always known what Zoraya had built. He had simply mistaken it for the way things naturally were. He closed the binder gently. No one came into the room. No one needed to. The quiet understood before he did. People rarely asked Alexander directly about the divorce. Most circled around it first. Then, sooner or later, someone always asked the same question. What happened? The first few times he answered simply, we grew apart. No one questioned him. The conversation moved on. Months later, another client asked over lunch. Alexander answered, without thinking, we'd been living separate lives for a long time. The sentence sounded familiar. He wasn't sure where it had come from. He only knew it felt easier to say than the first answer. A few weeks after that, an industry magazine interviewed him about Carter and Vale's newest community project. Near the end, the reporter asked gently, has the last year changed how you think about home? Alexander smiled politely. It has. And your marriage? A pause. It had been over long before either of us admitted it. The interview continued. Alexander never thought about the sentence again. Someone else did. That evening, Ariel closed the magazine after reading the interview twice. She wasn't disturbed by what Alexander had said. She was unsettled by what he hadn't. Months earlier, he had once described Zoraya as the kindest person I've ever known. Today, there wasn't a single mention of kindness. No accusation, no resentment, no gratitude. The sentence hadn't been replaced. It had quietly disappeared. Ariel folded the magazine and placed it back on the table. She said nothing. Several days later, Alexander unlocked the archive room again. He hadn't intended to come there. He found himself standing in front of the Morgan residence file. Inside was the familiar questionnaire. What do you want your home to feel like on an ordinary Tuesday? Beneath it sat another page, meeting notes, written in his own handwriting. He frowned. The date was from nearly 3 years earlier. Halfway down the page, he stopped reading. Remember to tell Zoraya, the Johnson family loved the shared courtyard idea. She asked about it this morning. Alexander read the sentence again. Then once more. He remained standing for a long time. The room stayed silent. He closed the folder carefully. That evening, he opened another box stored in his apartment closet. Old photographs, holiday cards, receipts. Near the bottom rested a small notebook, one he had carried during the nonprofit project. He flipped through it slowly. Most pages contained measurements and sketches. Then he reached a page that wasn't about architecture. Only one sentence. Zoraya wanted to hear about today. Don't forget tonight. No checkmark, no notes, nothing beneath it. Alexander stared at the page. His thumb rested along the edge for several seconds before he quietly closed the notebook. The following morning, Ariel stopped by his office before the first meeting. She found him reading one of the old questionnaires again. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, she asked, "Still finding new things?" Alexander smiled faintly. "I keep finding old things." She nodded. "So do I." The conversation ended there. Later that afternoon, a longtime supplier greeted Alexander in the parking lot. "I read the interview." Alexander smiled politely. "I hope it wasn't too painful." The supplier laughed. "No." He hesitated. "I remembered something, though." Alexander waited. "The first time I met your wife." He smiled at the memory. "She spent 20 minutes asking about my daughter's piano recital before we talked about windows." Alexander laughed softly. "That sounds like her." The supplier nodded. "I've never forgotten it." He climbed into his truck and drove away. Alexander remained standing beside his car. He realized that nearly every story people told him about Zoraya began the same way. Not with a building, not with a meeting, not with business, with how she made someone feel. That evening, Ariel packed her notebook before leaving the office. She opened it, read the first page. It contained the notes she had written after meeting Alexander months earlier. Asked whether his marriage was truly over, told him to go home, said unfinished conversations matter. She compared those notes to the story Alexander now told about the beginning of their friendship. It wasn't dramatically different, only simpler, cleaner, as though the difficult parts had quietly fallen away. Ariel rested the notebook on her desk. She picked up her pen, held it above the page, then lowered it again without writing a word. She closed the notebook, slipped it into her bag, turned off the office light, and walked out carrying one question she wasn't ready to ask. If ordinary memories can quietly become easier to live with, what happens to a relationship when the hardest truths slowly disappear first? The first morning began exactly the way every morning had for years. At 6 o'clock, the kitchen lights came on by themselves. A minute later, the coffee maker started brewing. Alexander walked downstairs, still half asleep. Nothing about the room looked unusual. He poured a cup, took one sip, then, without thinking, looked toward the other side of the table. "Morning." The word slipped out so naturally that he didn't even hear himself say it. Not until the silence answered. He stood there another moment before sitting down. The coffee slowly cooled beside him. The next morning, he followed the same routine. Kitchen lights, coffee, breakfast. He reached automatically for 2 mugs. His fingers closed around the second handle. He stared at it for a second, then quietly returned it to the cabinet. No explanation, no sigh. Only habit meeting a new reality. Thursday morning arrived. At exactly 8 o'clock, the gardener parked beside the side gate. Alexander happened to be working in the study. He watched through the window. The man greeted the roses before touching them. He clipped only the faded blooms, left the newer buds untouched, straightened the small watering can near the porch. Before driving away, he paused beside the lavender. He removed 3 tiny weeds growing between the stones. Alexander had walked past those flowers thousands of times. He had never noticed anyone doing that. The following afternoon, the housekeeper arrived carrying fresh linens. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter." "Good afternoon." She carried folded blankets upstairs. A few minutes later, Alexander noticed the guest room bed looked different. Not better, simply finished. He touched one corner of the blanket. The fold changed. She smiled. "No." "It didn't?" "I still fold them, the way Mrs. Carter asked." Alexander looked up. "Why this way?" "So guests can pull one corner over themselves without unfolding the whole blanket." She smoothed the edge once with her hand. She said people shouldn't have to wrestle with bedding when they're cold. She smiled politely and continued down the hallway. Alexander remained standing beside the bed. He had never once wondered why the blankets always looked the same. That evening, he opened the refrigerator. Glass containers lined the shelves. Each carried neat strips of blue tape. Monday, Tuesday, eat, first, freeze. He picked up one container. The handwriting was unmistakable. He read the label, then quietly placed it back exactly where it had been. He ordered dinner instead, not because he preferred it, because he couldn't bring himself to disturb the order someone else had carefully created. On Monday morning, a courier delivered travel documents. Alexander opened the envelope while standing at the kitchen counter. Flight confirmations, hotel reservations, conference schedule. Behind them rested a folded sheet of paper. He recognized the handwriting before unfolding it. "Your presentation starts at 9:30, but you'll feel less rushed if you arrive by 8:45. Don't skip breakfast. The cafe downstairs still makes the blueberry muffins you liked last spring." No signature. None was necessary. He checked the date. She had written the note before the night he ended the marriage. She had still been preparing for his future. He folded the paper again, more carefully than before. Tuesday afternoon, he opened the kitchen drawer, looking for batteries. Inside sat several small plastic organizers. Each one carried a hand-written label. Smoke detectors, October gate remote, spare. Thermostat, January. Flashlights, guest room. He closed the drawer, then opened it again. Nothing inside was expensive, nothing remarkable. Only years of someone quietly making sure ordinary life never became difficult. The florist knocked on Thursday. Alexander answered the door. The delivery driver looked down at his clipboard. "Good afternoon." "Afternoon." The driver frowned slightly. "I have the standing order." Alexander looked at the bouquet. White roses. Fresh eucalyptus. Exactly the arrangement Zoraya had ordered every other Thursday for the entry table. "I'm sorry," the florist said. "I forgot." Alexander looked at the flowers for a long moment. "I think she probably did too." The florist nodded with quiet understanding. "I'll remove the standing order." Alexander hesitated, then surprised himself. "No." The florist looked up. Alexander glanced toward the empty entryway. "Leave them." A few minutes later, he placed the vase in its usual place, beside the staircase. The house looked exactly as it always had, only now he knew why it always had. That evening, a floorboard creaked near the fireplace. Alexander smiled automatically. There it is. The words escaped before he realized he was speaking aloud. He walked toward the sound. Years earlier, he had offered to replace the board. Zoraya had refused. "It squeaks." "I know. So why keep it?" She had laughed. "It tells me someone's coming before they say hello." At the time, he had shaken his head. Now he rested one hand against the wall beside it. He didn't call a contractor. He simply stepped over the board and left it exactly as it was. Friday morning, the kitchen lights came on. The coffee brewed. Alexander poured one cup, then another. He carried both mugs toward the table before stopping halfway. He looked at the empty chair, the untouched newspaper, the vase of white roses, the herb garden outside the window. He carried the second mug to the sink, poured it out, rinsed the cup. The water continued running after the cup was already clean. Outside, the gardener looked toward the kitchen. He lifted one hand in greeting. Alexander waved back. The gardener returned to trimming the roses. Nothing about the morning seemed extraordinary. The house still worked. The lights still turned on. The flowers still bloomed. The blankets stayed folded. The batteries stayed organized. The coffee brewed exactly on time. For years, Alexander had believed those things simply happened. Standing alone in the quiet kitchen, he understood something that no blueprint had ever taught him. A home isn't held together by walls. It's held together by thousands of ordinary acts that no one thinks to call love while they're still happening. He stood there a little longer, not because the house had changed, because he finally had. Alexander wasn't looking for memories. He was looking for blueprints. The city had requested original structural drawings for one of Carter and Vale's earliest restoration projects, and Emma was certain they had been stored somewhere inside the Bel Air archive room years before everything changed. He unlocked an old built-in cabinet at the end of the study. Rolled plans filled the upper shelves. Storage boxes lined the bottom. Most carried simple labels. Stone samples. Landscape plans lighting. Near the back sat a cedar box with no label at all. He pulled it forward. Dust gathered beneath it in a faint square. The brass latch opened with almost no effort. Inside lay 12 envelopes, each one sealed, each one dated. Anniversary. 1. Anniversary 2. All the way to Anniversary 12. Alexander sat down without meaning to. For a long time, he simply looked at them. The first letter was short. You still leave cabinet doors open. I still close them behind you. I don't think either of us will ever change. I hope we always laugh about small things. Alexander smiled before he realized he was smiling. He remembered that apartment, the tiny kitchen, the mismatched dishes, the borrowed dining table. The third letter made him laugh quietly. Zoraya had drawn a terrible sketch of him trying to assemble a bookshelf upside down. Beneath it, she had written, "Architects should probably read instructions once in a while." He shook his head. "I forgot about that." The empty study offered no reply. He closed the box. He did not open another envelope that day. Instead, he returned the cedar box to the cabinet. Not hidden, simply back where it had been. The next evening, after work, he opened the fourth letter, then the fifth. Neither contained dramatic declarations. Most were filled with ordinary observations. The way he hummed while concentrating, how he always bought too many peaches in summer, the fact that he never remembered where he left his reading glasses but somehow always remembered the birthdays of his college roommates. She had been paying attention to things Alexander had never imagined anyone would write down. The 7th letter rested in his hands longer than the others. Thank you for believing my ideas belong beside yours. Every time you ask what I think before showing a design to a client, it reminds me that marriage isn't about standing behind each other. It's about standing beside each other. Alexander lowered the page. He tried to remember the last time he had asked that question before a client meeting. He couldn't. 3 days passed before he opened another envelope. He wasn't avoiding them. He simply couldn't read more than one at a time. Each letter seemed to stay with him long after he folded it closed. Sometimes during meetings, sometimes while driving, sometimes standing in the grocery store deciding which coffee to buy. The 10th anniversary letter contained almost nothing about the past. Instead, it spoke about the future. I think we should take one trip every year where neither of us is allowed to bring work. I want to know what you're becoming, not only what you're building. Alexander closed his eyes. He remembered, agreeing. He couldn't remember ever planning the trip. The 11th letter felt different, not colder, more honest. Lately, I've been wondering whether we've become excellent partners in running a life. I miss being curious about each other. Maybe that's what marriage keeps asking us to protect. There was no accusation, no disappointment, only a question she had never stopped hoping they could answer together. Alexander folded the letter along its original crease. His fingers lingered on the paper. He left the 12th envelope untouched for nearly a week. Every evening, he walked past the cedar box. Every evening, he stopped, then kept walking, until one quiet Sunday morning. The house was still. The coffee had gone cold beside him. He finally opened it. Inside was a single handwritten page, not longer than the others, not heavier, simply different. Happy anniversary. I almost wrote about the house, or the company, or everything we've managed to build. Instead, I want to tell you something I've been slow to understand. Alexander read on. I think I've mistaken taking care of us for truly knowing you. Somewhere along the way, I became very good at making life easier. I'm not sure I've been equally good at asking who you're becoming. He stopped, then continued. When your community project finally settles down, I'd love for us to start dating each other again. Not because we've fallen out of love, because I think we've slowly stopped introducing ourselves to the people we've become. Alexander lowered the letter into his lap. Outside, a bird landed briefly on the porch railing before lifting off again. The house remained completely still. He looked back at the page. The final paragraph waited near the bottom. If you read this years from now, I hope we'll smile, because we figured it out together. If we're reading it next month, let's choose a Tuesday. No meetings, no deadlines, no phones. Just two people getting curious about each other again. There was no goodbye, no warning, no prediction, only an invitation that had never been answered. Alexander folded the letter exactly the way he had found it. He returned it to the envelope, placed it back inside the cedar box, closed the lid. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He carried the box back to the cabinet and rested it on the shelf. Then he closed the cabinet doors without making a sound. On Monday morning, Emma found him standing quietly in the design studio before anyone else arrived. She handed him the day's schedule. He thanked her. As she turned to leave, he asked, "Emma?" She looked back. When Mrs. Carter asked clients about ordinary Tuesdays, he paused. "Did she ever tell you why?" Emma smiled gently. She said extraordinary days take care of themselves. Alexander waited. Emma's smile softened. It's the ordinary ones that decide whether people feel at home. She walked away before he could answer. Alexander remained where he was. The schedule stayed folded in his hand. For the first time, he understood that Zariah hadn't been trying to preserve perfect moments. She had spent 12 years protecting ordinary ones, and those had been the moments he had assumed would always be there. The cedar box stayed in the cabinet. Alexander did not open it again for several days, not because he wanted to avoid it, because every letter seemed to continue speaking long after he folded it closed. On Wednesday afternoon, he found himself standing in front of a client presentation with the 7th anniversary letter still lingering somewhere in the back of his mind. Marriage isn't about standing behind each other. He stopped halfway through explaining a floor plan. Instead of continuing, he looked across the conference table. Before we go any further, the young couple looked up. I'd like to ask you something we used to ask every family. He slid a blank sheet of paper toward them. What do you hope an ordinary Tuesday feels like in this house? The husband answered almost immediately. I want dinner to happen at the table more often than in front of the television. His wife smiled. I want our daughter to know she can always find us in the kitchen. Alexander wrote their answers down. He waited. Years ago, he would have moved on to the next design question. Instead, he heard Zariah's voice in memory, not literally, but in the rhythm of the conversations she used to have. He looked at the couple again. What happens in your family when someone has a bad day? They exchanged a surprised glance. No architect had ever asked them that. The conversation changed. By the end of the meeting, they had talked less about countertops and more about grandparents, noisy holidays, late-night homework, and the smell of homemade soup. When they left, the wife shook Alexander's hand. I've never felt this understood in a planning meeting. Alexander smiled politely. After the door closed, he remained standing beside the table. For the first time, he understood that the questionnaire had never been the important part. The questions only worked because someone genuinely wanted to know the answers. That evening, he opened the cedar box again. This time he didn't begin with the 12th letter. He returned to the first. He noticed something he had overlooked before. Every envelope carried a tiny pencil mark in the upper right corner. A date, not their anniversary. The day Zariah had written it, sometimes weeks early. Once, nearly 2 months before. She hadn't written the letters because the calendar reminded her. She had written them whenever she noticed something about him that she hoped he would never stop being. Alexander rested his thumb on the edge of the first envelope. He imagined her sitting somewhere in the house with a cup of tea, smiling to herself after catching another ordinary habit worth remembering. A cabinet door left open. A forgotten pair of reading glasses. The way he always looked out the passenger window whenever they crossed Mulholland Drive. None of those things seemed important then. Now they felt priceless. He carefully returned every envelope to the cedar box in the same order he had found them. Before closing the lid, he noticed one last thing. At the bottom of the box lay a single fountain pen. Its blue ink had long since dried. He picked it up. The cap was worn smooth where years of fingers had twisted it open. Without thinking, he uncapped it. Nothing. No ink. He smiled faintly, then carried the pen downstairs instead of putting it back. The next morning, on his way to the office, he stopped at a stationery shop. He bought fresh blue ink, not because he intended to write anything that day, because, for the first time in a very long while, he realized some things deserved to keep being used instead of quietly being put away. Ariel didn't call first. She sent a single message. Would you be willing to meet me? There's something I'd rather say in person. The reply came the next morning. Of course. No questions, no hesitation, only a time, only a place. They met at a small botanical garden halfway between the city and the coast. It wasn't private. Children wandered nearby with their parents. Retired couples strolled slowly along the walking paths. A volunteer trimmed roses beside the entrance. Life continued around them. Neither woman seemed to mind. When Zariah arrived, Ariel stood. For a brief second, they looked at one another without speaking. Then Zariah smiled politely. I'm Ariel. I know. And you're Zariah. I am. They shook hands. Neither held on longer than necessary. After ordering tea, they sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree. For a while, they spoke about ordinary things. The unusually warm weather, traffic, the garden. Neither woman hurried toward the difficult conversation. Eventually, Ariel looked down at the cup warming her hands. I've replayed this meeting in my head more times than I'd like to admit. Zariah smiled faintly. I imagine none of the versions sounded much like this. Ariel laughed softly. No, they didn't. Silence settled comfortably between them, not because there was nothing to say, because neither wanted to waste words. Finally, Ariel spoke. When Alexander and I met, I asked him more than once if his marriage was truly over. I believe you. He believed it. I believe that too. Neither statement sounded defensive, only honest. A breeze moved through the trees. Several leaves drifted onto the path. Ariel watched them for a moment. I've been thinking about something. Zariah waited. I used to believe relationships ended because one person stopped loving the other. She looked toward the flower beds. I don't think that anymore. Zariah nodded slowly. Neither do I. A volunteer nearby knelt to tie a climbing rose back onto its support. Neither woman watched him for long. Still, they both noticed. Zariah smiled almost to herself. They're easier to guide while they're still growing. Ariel followed her eyes. And harder after they've bent the wrong way. Their gazes met again. No explanation followed. None was needed. After another quiet moment, Ariel reached into her bag. She removed a folded sheet of paper. I found this after helping organize some project files. She slid it gently across the table. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't personal. It was a blank copy of the questionnaire. Across the top it read, "What do you want your home to feel like on an ordinary Tuesday?" Zariah smiled the moment she saw it. I wondered where these all disappeared to. I've watched Alexander start asking that question again. She paused. The first time he asked it, he didn't know what to say after the answer. Zariah's smile softened. No, he wouldn't. Ariel looked surprised. You already knew? He always listened carefully. Zariah answered, but I usually ask the second question. What was it? Zariah looked out across the garden. What helps you feel safe enough to become yourself here? Ariel sat very still. I don't think I ever heard him ask that. He couldn't. Zariah said it gently. I never taught him why I asked it. The server returned with fresh hot water. Neither woman spoke until he walked away. Finally, Ariel looked directly at her. I wanted to tell you something face to face. Zariah waited. I care about him. I know. I also don't think he's finished understanding what happened. Zariah lowered her eyes briefly. I don't think he is either. There was no triumph in her voice, only sadness. Ariel folded her hands together. I kept thinking time would solve it. She smiled without happiness. But understanding and time aren't the same thing. No, they're not. They sat for several minutes listening to birds somewhere high in the trees. Eventually, Ariel stood. I won't be continuing the relationship. Zariah looked up, not with relief, with compassion. You don't have to explain that to me. I think I needed to hear myself say it. Zariah nodded. I understand. A few days later, Ariel met Alexander after work. He noticed the small notebook in her hand, the one you've been carrying since the housing project. She smiled. I've decided to keep it. He nodded. I'm glad. She looked at him for a long moment. I think we've been trying to begin something while another story was still teaching you who you are. Alexander didn't interrupt. You've changed. I know. You'll probably keep changing. I hope so. So will I. A quiet smile passed between them. Not romantic, grateful. Ariel reached across the table and gently slid the notebook into her bag. I don't regret meeting you. I don't regret meeting you either. But I don't think we're meant to keep walking the same road. Alexander lowered his eyes. After a long pause, he nodded once. I think you're right. Neither reached for the other's hand. Neither tried to rescue the moment. Some endings become gentler when no one fights them. That evening, Alexander drove home alone. He parked in the driveway but didn't get out immediately. The porch light switched on as dusk settled over the neighborhood, exactly on time. He watched it through the windshield. For years he had believed love announced itself through extraordinary moments. Grand gestures, important anniversaries, life-changing decisions. Now he understood something different. Love had been waiting in ordinary Tuesdays, in questions left unfinished, in routines repeated without applause, in people who quietly made room for someone else to become fully known. He stepped out of the car. closed the door, and walked toward the light, carrying no certainty except one. The hardest truth wasn't that he had loved too little. It was that he had learned to see too late. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Carter & Vale had been selected to receive the American Institute of Residential Design's Lifetime Excellence Award for its influence on luxury home architecture. For years, Alexander had imagined what that evening might feel like. Standing backstage, he discovered he felt almost nothing. He adjusted his tie, accepted a microphone from the event coordinator, listened as someone rehearsed the introduction. The visionary whose work redefined what luxury living feels like. Alexander lowered his eyes. Those words used to sound accurate. Now they sounded incomplete. The ballroom was filled with architects, builders, designers, and former clients. Photographs of Carter & Vale projects moved across the large screen, one after another. The Morgan residence, the Lawson estate, the Bel Air restoration. Each image drew quiet admiration from the audience. More than once, someone whispered the same familiar sentence. Those homes always felt different. Alexander heard it. This time, he knew why. When his name was announced, the room stood. Applause followed him to the podium. He thanked the presenter, looked across the audience, then unfolded the note card he had prepared. He read the first sentence, stopped, folded the card again. He placed it on the podium. For years, he began, people have complimented our company by saying our homes felt warm long before anyone moved into them. A few people smiled. Alexander continued, I accepted those compliments. He paused. I shouldn't have accepted all of them. The room became very still. There is someone whose work shaped those homes in ways that never appeared on a blueprint. He took a slow breath. Zariah Carter. Several former employees exchanged quiet glances. No one looked surprised. Alexander noticed, many of the things clients remembered most weren't my ideas. The questions they were asked, the way meetings felt, the handwritten notes, the attention to ordinary life. Those came from her. He looked down briefly. I spent too many years believing architecture ended when the walls were finished. A faint smile crossed his face. She understood that was where it began. He stepped away from the microphone. No dramatic conclusion, no request for forgiveness, only the truth. The applause that followed felt different from the one that had welcomed him onto the stage. He didn't try to measure why. The next morning, Alexander arrived at his attorney's office, carrying a single folder. His attorney looked up. I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Alexander placed the folder on the desk. I've made a decision. The attorney opened it. Inside were signed transfer documents, every remaining financial interest, every residual claim, every future dispute already waived. He looked up. The settlement didn't require this. I know. You've already fulfilled every legal obligation. Alexander nodded. This isn't about legal obligations. The attorney studied him for a moment. Are you certain? Alexander thought of the porch light, the questionnaires, the anniversary letters, the coffee brewing every morning. He picked up the pen one final time. I'm certain. He signed the last page. The attorney witnessed the signature. No speeches followed, only the quiet sound of paper sliding back into the folder. On his way out, Alexander passed the receptionist's desk. She smiled. Congratulations on the award. Thank you. I watched your speech online. He looked slightly embarrassed. It wasn't much of a speech. She shook her head. My grandmother used to say that giving people credit while they're still alive is one of the rarest forms of generosity. Alexander smiled. I think your grandmother was wiser than most architects. She laughed. I think she'd enjoy hearing you say that. That afternoon, Alexander drove past the Bel Air mansion. He didn't slow down. He didn't pull into the driveway. He simply glanced toward the familiar gates. Through the trees, he could see movement on the front lawn. Several women carried large drafting tables toward the house. Someone laughed. The front door stood open. A moving truck unloaded shelves filled with sketchbooks and art supplies. The house wasn't waiting anymore. It was becoming something new. Alexander smiled, almost without realizing it. The light turned green. He continued driving. He never reached for the gate remote. He never looked for the old brass key. Some doors, he had learned, weren't meant to be reopened. They were meant to be left behind with gratitude for the life that had once existed on the other side. As he disappeared into afternoon traffic, the mansion grew smaller in his rearview mirror, not because it mattered less, because for the first time, he understood that belonging had never been something he could own. It had always been something entrusted to him by another person's daily acts of care. The first workshop began on another ordinary Tuesday. The front doors of the Bel Air mansion stood open long before anyone arrived. Boxes of sketchbooks rested beside the staircase. Drafting tables filled the old dining room. The library had become a design studio. The sunroom held shelves of fabric samples, wood finishes, and architecture books that had once lined the offices of Carter and Vale. Nothing in the house felt preserved. Everything felt useful. Zariah arrived before sunrise. She unlocked the front door, walked through each room without rushing, not to inspect, simply to notice. The same floorboard still creaked near the fireplace. She smiled without stopping. In the kitchen, the coffee maker started brewing at 6. She stood for a moment, listening to its familiar rhythm. Then she poured the first cup into a simple ceramic mug instead of the matching set that had once filled the cabinet. Some things, she had learned, didn't need replacing. They only needed a different future. The first women arrived carrying portfolios that looked as though they had been opened and closed 1,000 times. Some had worked as interior designers before raising children. Others had studied architecture years earlier but never finished. One had spent 15 years managing her husband's construction company without ever putting her own name on a drawing. Another admitted she hadn't sketched since college. They introduced themselves awkwardly. No one seemed certain they belonged there. Zariah greeted each one by name, not because she had memorized a list, because she had called every applicant herself. After everyone settled into their seats, the room grew quiet. No projector waited at the front. No prepared presentation filled the wall. Only a stack of blank paper rested on each table. Zariah picked up a pencil. "I've been asked what this foundation teaches." She looked around the room. "My honest answer is..." She smiled. "I'm still finding out." Soft laughter spread through the room. "It won't teach you how to become someone else. It will help you remember the parts of yourself that became easy to postpone." No one wrote anything down. They were listening too carefully. Instead of beginning with technical instruction, Zariah handed each woman a single page. Across the top were familiar words. "What do you want your work to feel like on an ordinary Tuesday?" Several participants looked at one another. One woman raised her hand. "There's no place here to write what kind of business we want." Zariah nodded. "That's intentional." Another asked, "What if I don't know yet?" "Then today is a good day not to pretend that you do." The room relaxed. Pens finally touched paper. The morning passed without anyone discussing profit margins or prestige. Instead, they talked about confidence, interrupted careers, the guilt of wanting something for themselves after spending years helping someone else's dream grow. One woman admitted she no longer knew whether she loved architecture or simply remembered loving it. Zariah didn't answer immediately. She walked over and sat beside her. "When was the last time you drew something that no one else needed from you?" The woman thought for a long time. "I don't remember." "Then don't start with a building." Zariah slid a blank page toward her. "Start with a window." At lunch, the women wandered through the gardens, carrying sandwiches and coffee. Laughter drifted across the lawn. Ideas bounced from one conversation to another. The house sounded different, not louder, lighter. Near the porch, the gardener looked up from the roses and smiled. "It feels alive again." Zariah followed his gaze across the lawn. "It always was." She paused. "I just couldn't hear it for a while." Late that afternoon, everyone gathered in the old living room. The tables were covered with rough sketches. Some were beautiful. Some barely looked like buildings. Zariah studied each one with the same attention. She never reached first for what needed improvement. She asked what the person had been trying to create. Again and again, the conversation became less about drawings and more about lives. As the last participants packed their bags, one woman lingered near the doorway. She hesitated before speaking. I almost didn't come. I'm glad you did. The woman smiled. I spent years introducing my husband as the architect. She looked down at the sketchbook tucked beneath her arm. I realized today. She laughed softly. I never introduced myself. Zoraya's smile lingered. I know that feeling. The woman nodded. I don't want to know it forever. That evening, the mansion grew quiet again. Chairs were pushed back beneath the tables. Pencils rested where they had been left. Half-finished sketches remained clipped to drawing boards for tomorrow. Zoraya walked through each room, switching off lights one by one. When she reached the front hall, she paused beside the vase of fresh white roses. Their fragrance filled the entryway. She adjusted one stem that had leaned slightly to the side. Then she smiled to herself, not because everything had worked out the way she once imagined, because the house had finally become a place where no one would have to disappear in order for someone else to shine. She turned off the last light. Outside, the porch lamp came on at exactly 6. For the first time in many years, it welcomed people who were learning that generosity and visibility could belong in the same life. 9 months later, Carter and Vale unveiled what several architecture journals would eventually describe as one of the most thoughtful private residences built in California that year. The praise arrived quickly. Articles celebrated the careful balance between luxury and warmth. Design schools requested tours. Clients called months in advance hoping to join the waiting list. Alexander accepted the congratulations politely. He thanked his team. He answered interviews. He shook hands. Yet every compliment seemed to settle differently now, no longer like proof, more like responsibility. The evening after the final walkthrough, the owners invited him to stay as long as he liked before they moved in the following week. When the last contractor drove away, the house became completely still. Alexander walked through it alone. The kitchen opened naturally toward the family room. The windows caught the last light of the afternoon. A window seat overlooked an old oak tree, where children would someday climb. He smiled. Without thinking, he reached into his pocket. His phone was already in his hand before he realized why. His thumb rested over one familiar name. For several seconds, he simply looked at it. Then he smiled to himself, locked the screen, slipped the phone back into his pocket. Some conversations belonged to memory, not because they no longer mattered, because they had already changed the person who would have spoken them. He continued through the house. Near the back hallway, he noticed a floorboard that gave the slightest creak. The builder had apologized for it earlier that morning. We can replace it tomorrow. Alexander remembered the conversation. He had answered without thinking. No. The superintendent had looked confused. It doesn't affect the structure. No, it isn't noticeable. Alexander had smiled. I know. He left it exactly as it was. Before leaving, he placed a small envelope inside the homeowner's welcome binder. No signature appeared on the note. Only one question. What do you want your home to feel like on an ordinary Tuesday? He closed the binder, turned off the lights, and locked the front door behind him. Across town, another ordinary Tuesday was coming to an end. The old Carter mansion no longer sounded the way it once had. The library hummed with quiet conversations. The dining room held drafting tables instead of formal place settings. Sketches covered the walls. Half-finished models rested beside coffee mugs. Someone laughed from the sunroom. Someone else asked for another opinion on a design. The gardener walked past the front windows carrying fresh lavender. He paused for a moment, smiled, then continued toward the side garden. Inside the kitchen, Zoraya rinsed 2 coffee mugs before placing them on the drying rack. One of the women stepped into the room carrying rolled drawings. I think I'm finally starting to believe I belong here. Zoraya looked up. I hope one day you won't have to believe it. The woman tilted her head. I hope you'll simply know. The woman smiled. I think today helped. As everyone prepared to leave, a young designer stopped beside the front door. I almost forgot. She reached into her bag and held up the questionnaire they had completed on the first day. The edges were worn from being folded and unfolded. I keep reading this. Zoraya smiled. Have the answers changed? The young woman laughed. Almost every week. Good. They're supposed to. When the last car disappeared down the driveway, the house grew quiet again. Not empty, simply resting. Zariah walked through the familiar rooms, switching off lamps one by one. The old floorboard creaked beneath her feet. She smiled without looking down. Some things deserved to remain exactly as they were. She reached the front porch. The evening air carried the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. The porch light came on automatically, right on time. She stood there for a moment, listening to the sounds drifting from neighboring homes. Children calling to one another, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, someone laughing over dinner. Ordinary life, the kind she had once spent years trying to protect for everyone else. This time, she was part of it too. Across the city, Alexander pulled into his driveway. Before going inside, he looked toward the quiet house waiting for him. He smiled, not with triumph and not with sorrow, only with gratitude. He finally understood something that had taken him years to learn. Buildings become beautiful because of design. Homes become unforgettable because someone quietly chooses, day after day, to help another person feel seen. Some people spend their lives building remarkable places. Others spend their lives teaching those places how to welcome the people inside them. He had been fortunate enough to know someone who did both. He stood there one last moment before walking toward his front door. Behind him, another porch light flickered on somewhere down the street. Ahead of him, another ordinary Tuesday waited to be lived. And somewhere, in a house once built for 2 people and now filled with many more, the coffee maker was already set for 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Before we say goodbye, I'd like to leave you with the same question that quietly changed this story. What do you want your home to feel like on an ordinary Tuesday? Not your perfect day, not your dream vacation, just an ordinary Tuesday. Sometimes we don't realize the greatest expressions of love aren't the big moments we remember. They're the small routines we stop noticing until they're gone. I'd love to hear your answer in the comments. And if there was one moment in Alexander and Zariah's journey that stayed with you, tell us why. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. If stories like this remind you to slow down, notice the quiet acts of love around you, and see people a little more clearly, I hope you'll join us again here at Greer Stories. Until next time, take good care of yourself. And don't wait for a special occasion to let the people you love know they've been seen.